Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment or two. We'll make sure most people are on, and then we will get started. I'm going to give it about 30 more seconds, and then we will go ahead and get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. For those who don't know me, I am Hannah Young with Nonprofit Association of the Midlands, and I am the Public Policy and Communications Manager here. And so we are so happy to have back Rebecca Firestone and Craig Beck with OpenSky Policy Institute to kind of give us a brief budget update and what they expect in the next legislative session starting soon. So thank you both so much for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, Hannah, thank you so much for the invitation to talk to everyone who's part of NAM today. We're really grateful for the invitation. I'm Rebecca Firestone, Executive Director at OpenSky Policy Institute, and with me is Craig Beck, our Senior Fiscal Policy Analyst. We're going to have a conversation about what we're seeing with our current state's fiscal picture for this year. This will go for about 25 minutes or so. And then after that, we have time for question and answers from all of you in the audience. So please put your questions into the Q&A box, and we will make sure to answer as many of your questions as we can. For those of you who don't know us, OpenSky Policy Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research institute. We're based in Lincoln, Nebraska, and we focus on tax and budget policy for the state of Nebraska. So our focus as an organization is to make the state budget as accessible as possible to everyone in Nebraska, because we think it's important for all of us to understand where our tax dollars are going and how they are being used to support state priorities. So we're really excited to get into the budget process and talk about what we see coming up in the next legislative session, and really want to make sure that if you do have questions about where the state budget is coming from or how it's going to get used, like, please let us know what questions you have. But to start, Craig, I mean, the first thing I think we wanted to talk about is that basically this year, starting in January 2023, the makeup of our state government is going to look a little bit different. We have a number of new legislators who are coming in, and legislative session starts on January 4th. And we also have a new governor. Since it's been a while, what does the budget process look like when we have a new governor coming into office?
Sure. So the new governor will have to introduce his budget proposal by February 1st of the upcoming legislative session. He has a little more time than a sitting governor normally would, who would have to introduce their budget proposal by January 15th in a normal year. The proposal will be shaped by agency requests, but the new governor will get some extra time to build a budget that reflects his administration's priorities. The budget proposal then will go to the Appropriations Committee, and they must introduce a final budget onto the floor, of the legislature by day 70, which happens to be May 2nd of the upcoming legislative session.
Great. And so this is a year when the legislature is really working on a budget, and statutorily they have to have a budget passed by the end of the session.
Correct.
Right. Okay. All right. So with that background, can you give us an overview about what the state's fiscal situation looks like coming into this legislative session?
Sure. So there is little doubt that Nebraska is currently in a strong fiscal situation. We continue to benefit from extraordinarily strong revenue growth, which means that we will have a lot of money available for legislation in 2023. Looking at the state's pre-session finances, the big things that we see are almost $2 billion worth of extra funds and a pretty healthy state savings account.
So we have $2 billion of extra funds, or basically a budget surplus. What do all of us on this call need to know about that surplus?
Sure. So there are a couple of important things that I think we need to know about the surplus. The first thing that I would say is when I'm talking about the surplus, what I'm really talking about is a projected excess of funds over projected spending in the state's general fund or its main discretionary fund. I kind of like to think of the state general fund as analogous to my own checking account, excuse me. But I think it's really important to note that both that excess of funds and the spending that we are utilizing at this point to calculate the surplus are projections. So we are coming into a year where, as we just talked about, the legislature will have to develop the next state budget. And to arrive at the surplus, or the amount of excess funds that we project to have at the end of that budget, we are utilizing the best possible estimates that we have for both tax revenue and state spending at the time. But I think it might help to put that into perspective a bit, because we are talking about estimating revenues that the state will not collect fully until June of 2025. So that is a really long time from now, and there's a lot of things that can happen in the meantime. And then on the budget front, as we've already talked about, the legislature will be crafting a budget in the upcoming session. We will know at the end of the session what the state authorizes for its spending for the next 2-year budget cycle. And we know that as of right now, the legislators will have about $1.9 billion in excess or surplus funds after the projected budget has already been accounted for. So I think more or less, to really sum this up, the surplus is the projected tax revenue that we're going to collect over the next 2 fiscal years, minus the projected spending for the next 2 fiscal years. And then the difference, or the surplus, can be allocated through the budget process during the 2023 session.
Okay, so this estimated extra amount is fairly large, but it's based on assumption about what's going to be happening over the next 2.5 years, right?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. But if we look at the news right now, we've been going through a lot of economic change, and we are expected to continue to face some economic uncertainty. So what does that mean for the likelihood of this budget surplus materializing?
Absolutely. We are in fairly uncertain economic times, I would say. The economy faces uncertainty through things like inflation, interest rates, a potentially looming recession. One thing I would note is that one state economist last week, in fact, said that a recession in 2023 for Nebraska is the likely scenario. So if we do have a recession, the amount of surplus that we're projecting at this point could absolutely decrease.
Okay, can you walk us through why we might expect that budget surplus to be smaller in the event that the state does go into a recession?
Sure, that is a great question. So anytime we have a recession, state revenues will typically decline as a result of a decline in economic activity. When you collect less revenue than we are currently projecting, the surplus would necessarily reduce. So that's how you reduce. Mm-hmm.
The economy slows, the state collects less in taxes. We've got less money to spend as a state. So
correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, all right. But at this point in time, we are projecting to have a budget surplus of almost $2 billion. Can you help put that into context? What does $2 billion look like?
Yes. So I think that it can be difficult to comprehend the difference between, say, $1 million and $1 billion. And even for someone like me who works with these numbers every day, billion has become a pretty commonplace number that we throw around a lot. And it is substantially more money than $1 million. So if we, for example, equate the surplus, the budget surplus to time, for example, 1 million seconds would be about 11 days. 1 billion seconds would be about 32 years. So we are talking a difference of years and days when we talk about 1 million seconds versus 1 billion seconds.
Great. And in this setting, since we're almost 2 billion, we're talking about more like 64 years of money to spend, or that potentially could be spent. So yeah, so 2 billion is a big number. How did we get here? How did we end up having such a large projected budget surplus?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would first note that Nebraska is not alone in having strong finances at the moment, as well as a large surplus. Many states do. But it is widely recognized that these surpluses are a result of the significant federal stimulus that has come into states through the pandemic. The stimulus absolutely helped prop up state economies and brought with it strong economic growth. The one caveat, though, and the one really important thing to remember about that federal funding is that it is temporary. And most of it, in fact, has already run its course. Most of it has worked its way through the economy.
Okay. So we shouldn't bank on the circumstances of our current fiscal situation continuing. Is that right?
I think that's right. Yes. There's no doubt that there is a lot of money, but I think we need to be realistic about it. With all the economic uncertainty that we've already discussed, as well as the surplus likely resulting from that federal stimulus, we do need to be careful with how we use it. If, for example, our tax revenues decline in future years and we have spent our current surplus on ongoing items like, for example, tax cuts, we risk not being able to fund vital services that Nebraskans rely on in the future.
Okay. So let's shift gears a little bit. We've been talking about the general fund, which is a little bit like the state's checking account. So let's talk a little bit about the cash reserve, which at OpenSky, we like to think about that as the state's savings account. What do all of us on this call need to know about the state's savings account?
So the state savings account, or the cash reserve fund, has a lot of money in it right now. We are currently sitting at about $1.7 billion in the fund. That's a record amount. And then if our current revenue projections are accurate for the fiscal year that we are currently in, there will be about $2.3 billion in the fund after this fiscal year ends.
Okay, and can you remind us when this fiscal year ends, Craig? Sure,
this fiscal year will end June 30th of 2023.
Okay, great. So we're looking at $2.3 billion sort of sitting in the cash reserve by sometime in the middle of next year.
If revenues materialize, yes, that is correct.
If revenues materialize. So people have been talking about how that balance is higher than what's actually recommended. What does that actually mean for legislators?
Sure. So having a cash reserve balance that is greater than the recommended level is certainly a very important thing, and it's really a great thing. We at OpenSky believe that the high balance should be maintained to help the state weather any future economic downturn. And, particularly when we are facing a potential recession, we here at OpenSky really believe that maintaining a balance greater than recommended levels in the rainy day fund is important.
Okay, great. So you just refer to the cash reserve as a rainy day fund. Can you talk a little bit more about why people refer to it that way?
Sure. So rainy day and cash reserve fund are really interchangeable, but we call it a rainy day fund because we put money into that fund to help us when rainy days come, right? So in any time in the future when our revenues are not coming in as expected, or we have increased expenditures that we need to pay for, it's always nice to have a pot of money set aside where you can tap into to fund the state government and ensure that, for example, if revenues are down, services don't have to get cut. So it's a really vital fund for the state to have and maintain.
Okay, great. But that when we're looking at a budget surplus in the general fund, that rainy day has probably not yet arrived. So
yes, I would say that's a fair statement. Yes.
Yeah, about sort of maintaining a robust balance in the cash reserve for the time when a rainy day arrives. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, didn't senators agree last year that the balance in that cash reserve fund should remain higher than is recommended to help the state phase in tax cuts?
They did, yes. So senators did in the spring of 2022 pass the largest tax cut in Nebraska state history. And as part of those tax cuts, it was agreed that the cash reserve would maintain a balance that is higher than previously recommended levels. And the reason was really just to help ensure that the state could weather any negative economic or revenue impact resulting from the tax cuts. In the event that we do experience negative revenue effects, the cash reserve, as we just talked about, would really be vital to ensuring that state services are protected from future cuts.
Let's talk a little bit more about the tax cuts that the legislature has passed recently. Just give us a little more background on what was happened there.
Sure. So the legislature has really spent the last 3 legislative sessions cutting taxes. This past spring, as I mentioned, the legislature enacted LB 873, which is the largest tax cut in Nebraska history. The tax cuts over the past 3 legislative sessions have really focused on property and income taxes. Specifically, LB 873 cut the corporate income tax. It cut the top personal income tax. It eliminated state income tax on Social Security benefits, as well as increased funding for existing property tax credits. These cuts will phase in over the next few years, and when they are fully implemented, they are expected to reduce state revenues by about $1 billion on an annual basis.
So we're looking at about $1 billion less in revenues coming in once these tax cuts take effect. We were talking a little bit before about trying to wrap our heads around what $1 billion could mean for a budget surplus. Can you help us understand what does $1 billion in less state revenue look like in Nebraska?
Sure. So if we look at our current budget, the state currently allocates about $1 billion, a little more, annually to finance public K-12 education in the state. So I think, if we look at that $1 billion of revenue reductions into the future that LB 873 will bring, you could equate that to roughly, the state's portion on an annual basis to fund K-12 education, which of course is a vital and very important service that the state provides.
Okay, great. So basically that means having potentially less revenues for something as large as what the state contributes to K-12 education.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about who's going to see the effects of those tax cuts that just got passed in the spring. Who are they targeted towards?
Yeah. So, the cuts were really designed so that Nebraska taxpayers who are at the top of the income distribution, or who have the highest and higher incomes among us, are really the biggest beneficiaries of these tax cuts. If we look at LB 873 specifically, the personal income tax cuts that were enacted as part of that bill only target the state's top income tax rate. So that means that in order to be paying at the state's top income tax rate, you have to have income above certain thresholds that are relatively high. And also, if you look at the property tax portions of LB 873, they provide no benefit to renters. So they only provide benefits to people who own homes, who, as we know through the data, tend to have higher median net worths than those who rent. So the way that these tax cuts were designed, they're really benefiting the people at the top of the income distribution, and really provide little to no benefit for those at the bottom, to low and middle income Nebraskans.
So, okay. So that's what happened in the spring, and we're hearing now some discussion in the media about more tax cuts being considered for this next session. What would that mean for the state's future finances?
Sure. So as we've already talked about, the projected surplus is widely recognized as having resulted from the federal pandemic funds that came in. And those were one-time funds. Additional tax cuts could impact future state revenues because, if we enact further tax cuts on what really amounts to an artificial bump in revenue, any future downturn in revenue would just be exacerbated by any additional cuts that we make.
Okay. How could that surplus be used instead of using it for tax cuts?
So the money that is available will present opportunities to fund many things that people on this call would like to see supported. Things such as additional funding for affordable housing, mental health services, workforce training, public transportation, just to name a few. The OpenSky team was wonderful and ran some numbers for me this morning. And we determined that on the state's average SNAP allocation on a monthly basis, which is $247, we could feed more than 7 million people for a year with that $1.9 billion general fund surplus.
We don't even have 7 million people in the state of Nebraska.
We do not.
Yeah.
That's more than 3 times the population of the state.
Yeah.
So we also looked at some childcare costs, and at the average annual cost of childcare, which is about $12,000 per child per year, we could provide childcare with that surplus for more than 150,000 kids for 1 year.
Okay, that's a lot of kids who could have access to childcare with the budget surplus that we have.
Yes.
There's also been some talk in the media about returning that surplus to taxpayers because the surplus came about because we're collecting too much in taxes. So how's that possible? How could you think about trying to return a surplus to taxpayers?
Sure. So it would actually be relatively easy to just return the surplus to taxpayers. All or a portion of it could be returned via a tax refund. And I would also note about the prospect of refunding the surplus is that any amount that we would refund would not result in future decreased tax collections because it wouldn't reduce the state's ability to raise taxes.
Okay. So the state could just return some of that money as a tax refund to taxpayers. Is there any precedent for states going about such a simple solution?
Yes. Many states over the last couple years have sent tax refunds to their taxpayers with the large surpluses that states have been, having as a result of the federal stimulus that's been coming into states.
Okay, so this is something that Nebraska could do along with other state governments.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Is there anything else that we think the folks on this call need to know about the state's fiscal situation?
Yeah, I think that I would add that in the projected budget for 2023, again, I say projected because we're just operating off of the best data that we have right now, which does encompass agency requests that have been submitted already, but ultimately the legislature has final discretion over what the budget will be. The projected budget does include a 2.5% provider rate increase for Medicaid, developmental disability, behavioral health, and child welfare providers. But I will note that the agency's budget request did not include any increases for a 2.5 for a provider rate increase, excuse me. And I think that when we look at inflation and how it's been high as of late, I think it's unclear if even 2.5% is going to be enough of a bump. And again, I would stress that the increases are only in the projected budget as of right now. So we will need to watch carefully whether the Appropriations Committee takes the recommendation from the projected budget and increases provider rates by 2.5%, or whether the committee chooses to accept the agency request, which again did not request any additional funds for provider rate increases.
Okay. So provider rates, there was a lot of talk in the last legislative session about that, and important to keep on watching what the legislature does in that area. What are some other big fiscal issues that we all need to keep an eye on as we go into this next legislative session?
Sure, I think that there are a few things that we should keep an eye out for. First, I would say that the governor-elect's proposed public K-12 education funding shift would have major fiscal implications for the state. That proposal would shift the state to a per student funding system away from our current funding system, which looks at a district's needs and resources and then distributes the bulk of the state's funding to public education to districts based on need. At OpenSky, we are concerned that the proposed shift would hurt districts that educate the vast majority of kids in the state. We are also watching out for school privatization efforts. We do anticipate legislation to direct public dollars to private schools, including by the way of tax credits for donations to private scholarship programs, which we have seen come up in the legislature over the last few years, more than once. And we are concerned that such measures would reduce funding available for public schools. And then the last item that I think that I would lift up is the likely return of the consumption tax proposal. So the consumption tax, which we've harped on a bit here, but just to remind everybody, it would essentially replace all of the state's current means of taxation with a single sales tax or a consumption tax. And that would be on all new goods and services. We have many concerns with this proposal, including that the rate required for it to be revenue neutral is likely to be much higher than proponents are claiming right now. And also that it would tie the hands of local governments, because each local government that currently sets and funds its own budget would need to suddenly every year go to Lincoln to secure funding for their local government funding, which, as we know, local governments are best served by the local people that run them. So,
okay. Any fiscal policies that might be of interest to folks on this call?
Yes, there has been some talk recently about legislation to enact a state-level child tax credit in Nebraska. So we've collected a lot of data on the effect of the federal child tax credit during the pandemic, particularly with the expansion of the federal credit under the American Rescue Plan. And the results are pretty clear. The child tax credit is an immensely powerful tool that helps to reduce child poverty. If the state were to create its own credit, it would build on the positive effects of the federal credit that our state residents are currently receiving, and it would help to further reduce child poverty in the state.
Okay. We've covered a lot. Anything else, Craig?
I think I am done.
Okay, so there's a number of fiscal policies that OpenSky will be watching and communicating about to all of you over the course of this legislative session in order to understand their fiscal implications and what they mean for state services. And but also just to recap, right now we are looking at a state projected budget surplus of almost $2 billion that may become available, but the legislature has that to potentially spend over this next legislative session. It's not certain those numbers will actually materialize. That available budget surplus is likely only temporary, so there could be funds available for strategic short-term investments. But this budget surplus doesn't necessarily give us the fiscal space to be able to make permanent changes to our tax code. Is that a good way of sort of summing up of basically what we were covering, Craig?
Yes, it is.
Okay. All right. Great. And Hannah's back on. So I think we've got a couple questions coming in, and Hannah, can you help us field those?
Yep. If anyone has questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we will get to as many as we can. So the first one is the inflation rate taken into account in the budget?
That's a really good question. It is in a sense that in agency requests, I think there was about $45 million included over the next biennium that really amount to inflation increases. But as far as like a blanket inflation factor applied across the budget, there's not something like that.
Okay. And then if you are able to comment, would you comment on Pillen newly elected Governor Pillen wanting to form a committee to look at how education is funded?
Yeah. I can, I think at least sort of describe, I think, what we see happening in that area. So the governor-elect spent some time on the campaign trail sort of talking, I think, about some of his concerns with how state funds for K through 12 education are allocated in the state, and was raising that a potential issue that there's a disparity in how the funds are allocated across school districts in the state. So those state dollars go to almost 80% of the students in the state, but if you actually look at how they're allocated by school districts, there's a large proportion of school districts that receive relatively little state funding. So I think the governor is sort of raising this issue and how state dollars are allocated, and has been, the governor-elect, and the governor-elect has also been talking about shifting to some sort of per student mode of allocating those dollars. He has formed a committee, and I think some of the membership of that committee was announced on Twitter last week. There's a variety of legislators and school representatives, and I believe also representatives from agriculture and some other groups that are also on that committee. Our understanding is that that committee is meeting right now and will be looking to put together some sort of proposal for the legislature to continue to consider in the next session. What the makeup of that actual proposal will be, I think we'll wait to see. And OpenSky regularly analyzes all school funding proposals that come through the legislature to understand what they do to adequacy of school finances, as well as what they do to property tax levies, since there's a really important interaction between what funds are available on the state level for that the state's contributing to K through 12 education locally, and what that means for local property taxes. So think we'll look to see what happens with that proposal and try to understand what it's going to mean for local school districts and what kind of funds they have available.
Great. You mentioned regarding provider rate increases that there's a difference between the proposed budget and the agency budget. Who develops the proposed budget that has proposed provider rate increases?
Yes, that's a great question. So the Legislative Fiscal Office is who has developed the projected budget that we've been speaking of today. And they developed that proposed budget. Again, of course, the legislature will have final say in the coming session as to what is actually funded and what is not. But the fiscal office's proposed budget takes into account agency requests, as well as, things that are likely to be needed that may not be in the requests. And, clearly they felt that a 2.5% provider rate increase would be necessary. So they put it in their projections.
Great. I think, okay, we have one more question. If anyone has questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Do the legislators and governor-elect understand state funding versus state aid?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I think really what the heart of this question is that when we talk about school funding, that there's kind of a blanket statement that we talk about when we say state aid, which is the state's portion that it contributes to funding our K through 12 public education. Obviously, the bulk of public K through 12 funding comes from local property taxes, but the state does contribute, as we mentioned, about $1 billion annually to help fund. Within that $1 billion, there's a couple different pots of money. One of the biggest portion of that money is what we call equalization aid. That is the needs minus resources portion of the formula. That is allocated to districts, again, who have higher needs than they do resources. And not every district does get equalization aid funding because, again, their resources are determined within the formula to be greater than their needs. But there is a separate pot of funding. It is smaller, but that we just refer to as state aid, which every school does get a portion of. So every school gets state aid, but not necessarily every school district would get equalization aid within the formula.
And if I can, I think, add something onto that, a lot of our debate, a lot of the discussions in Nebraska around education funding are sort of based on implications for property owners. Nebraska does have a heavier reliance on property taxes in our tax code than in other states. We spent a lot of time talking about who pays for public education and relatively less time talking about what kind of value for money we're getting as a state in terms of our investments, both at the state and the local level, in terms of how those investments are leading to student achievement. There are other states that look at incorporating student achievement measures into how they do their state funding formula. But at this point, Nebraska, with the current model, focuses on what kind of funds are available, or sort of what resources available, and what kind of student needs there are. And there isn't currently a place to think about student outcomes.
Great. Next question. Do you see any parallels to 2000 when large surpluses were spent and then a recession happened, resulted in states scrambling to make cuts and cover services?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that we can for certain say that that's the path that we're headed down. But I think that's really the crux of the matter, right? Is there's a lot of uncertainty out there. We do have a significant amount of money available as a surplus, but we know that surplus is largely built on one-time funds that probably aren't coming back. And so if we do set ourselves up by enacting, ongoing significant spending items through tax cuts or really any spending item that is ongoing into the future, we could put ourselves on the path toward something, of something similar to the dot-com bubble in 2000 when that did happen. But ultimately, we hope that that the state does not set off down that path.
I would say that I think it's actually really useful for us to be going back to some of those historical experiences, and there's actually a lot of lessons to learn from what happened in the early 2000s with changes to the tax code and the dot-com bubble. So important for us not to let history repeat itself. And I mean, a general principle there is making long-term structural changes to the tax code, particularly in the shape of tax cuts, leads to greater volatility in state revenues, which means then your state is much more susceptible to economic volatility in terms of what's happening in the economy. So I think that's fair, Craig.
Yes.
That we're sort of introducing more uncertainty into how the state plans for its revenues and its expenditures when we're making those big structural changes to the tax code.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. All right.
What is the impact to the surplus of some of the big ticket items being floated around, such as the new prison, Perkins Canal, and Ashland Recreational Lake?
Sure. Those are all big ticket items that could absolutely be funded with the surplus dollars. I will say that those items are not currently in the projected budget because those will need to be introduced as legislation and then carried through the process. So it will be up to the legislature as to whether those priorities are funded with the surplus.
Can the committee proposed by the governor-elect for per student funding exist outside of the education committee already in the legislature?
I can try to take a stab at that one, Craig, if you want to back me up. I think our understanding is that committee, the committee that's been formed by the governor-elect is working on some proposed legislation. And then as with any proposal having to do with education policy, it would go in front of the education committee in the legislature for hearing and debate.
Yes.
Great. Since Senator Clements is projected chair of the Appropriations Committee coming up, do you think he'll have a similar agenda, or do you think he'll follow the governor's recommendations? Or any agenda, sorry, or do you think he'll follow the governor's recommendations?
Do you want me to take a stab at that, Rebecca?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, I mean, ultimately, I think we'll just have to see. I'm not sure that we for certain know who will be the Appropriations Committee chair, but whomever it is, they may decide that, the committee is typically thoughtful in how it analyzes the budget and will accept some recommendations and will put, forth their own recommendations forward to the full legislature that differ from the governor's request.
Perfect. Okay. Is there a possibility that the per student funding proposal would be for all students rather than students attending public school as a means to provide public dollars to private schools?
I can take that one, Craig. I think our understanding is that this proposal is specifically around how the state allocates public dollars to public schools. And there would need to be some substantial legislative changes for Nebraska to consider allocating public dollars to private schools. So I think what the governor-elect is talking about right now is specifically having to do with how dollars are allocated for public schools.
Okay, great. I believe that is all of the questions we have. So thank you very much to both Rebecca and Craig for your knowledge and help kind of understanding these complicated issues. We really appreciate your expertise in this. For everyone else, I went ahead and threw a Google form link in the chat. We have weekly meetings where we talk about things coming up in the legislature. These are our weekly advocacy calls we've done in the past with the Nebraska Civic Engagement Table and Coalition for a Strong Nebraska. They were previously on Tuesdays. They have started. They are on Thursdays at noon. You must be a member of one of the 3 organizations to attend, but if you are and haven't signed up yet, go ahead and fill out that link and we will get you on the agenda for those. And I just wanted to say a big thank you again to Rebecca and Craig. This will be recorded and put up on our YouTube channel in the next 24 hours or so. You will get a follow-up email with that recording, and then we will send out a short evaluation as well. So thank you so much again. We really appreciate your help.
Hannah, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to be able to talk with all of you today.
Thank you.